Amazing. I'm super delighted to be welcoming you all to our webinar on measuring the well-being of farmers in coffee supply chains. My name is Malvika, and I'm your moderator for today. I'm a senior associate based out of the India office of 60 Decibels, and I largely focus on agriculture. My colleagues at 60 Decibels have been spending a lot of time over the past few months trying to answer a simple sounding yet complex question, which is, are farmers in the coffee supply chain thriving, or are they merely surviving? And should we even care about this? To answer this and more, we have an exciting action-packed agenda ahead of us. So let me talk you through what's brewing today. So I want you to think about how coffee moves across the supply chain and the various stakeholders that could potentially be a part of it. Luckily, all of our panelists represent a certain node of how coffee moves. So first up, we would have Katie from Counterculture Coffee, a coffee brand you may be familiar with. She's going to talk us through why transparency matters in the coffee supply chain. Next, we'll have Kenneth representing Mountain Harvest Coffee from Uganda. Mountain Harvest works very closely with smallholders, sources coffee, and supports them with other initiatives such as advisory, etc. He's going to talk about the business case for farmer well-being and why it should matter. And finally, Ellie from 60 Decibels is going to talk us through what growers had to say. 60 Decibels conducted a study called the Farmer Thriving Index to hear from over 3,000 farmers on their experience on ground. And at the end, you, our audience, will have the opportunity to engage with the panelists and share any of your reflections, comments, and questions using the Zoom Q&A chat box. This should be visible to you, either anonymously or with your name. So to warm us up, I have two questions for our audience here. And feel free to answer this using the Zoom poll feature that should pop up on your screen any minute. First up, how many cups of coffee do you consume in a day? Feel free to take a few seconds to just answer it in the pop-up window on your screen. Amazing. Wow. I thought it would be more of a normal distribution. I think it is, but looks like most of us are between 2 to 3 cups a day, and we need it to function. Amazing. Let's move on to our next question. Do you know where your coffee is sourced from? And there's no judgments. You don't need to know this, but we're curious. Oh, wow. That's incredible. Roughly 20% of us just know the brand where it comes from. And a third of us said that we just know the country, and the rest of us are not fully sure. It's interesting to see these results, and it's certainly fascinating because of how ubiquitous coffee is to all of our lives. And I'm very excited to, on this note, launch the agenda for this webinar and talk us through just what farmers have to say and what we know about the coffee supply chain. So first up, I'd like to introduce you to your first panelist, Katie. She's a coffee manager at Counterculture Coffee. Counterculture sources high-quality single-origin beans from across 20 countries in the world, with a large focus on East Africa as well. Katie, thanks so much for joining us. My first question to you is why transparency matters to a company like Counterculture Coffee, and generally, why should it matter to the supply chain at large?
Hey, everybody. Good morning here in California. Good afternoon, evening, wherever you're joining us from. Like Malavika said, my name is Katie Carguilo. I've worked in coffee for over 2 decades. I started as a barista, and I've worked at Counterculture for a while now, and for the past 10 years have been working in some form of coffee buying, QC, operations kind of side of things. Counterculture's been around since 1995, and we are kind of a unique specialty coffee business. We are a coffee roaster, but we don't actually have any cafes ourselves. We only kind of wholesale coffee to other businesses. So we sell coffee to grocery stores, we sell coffee to cafes, restaurants, hotels, and we also have a small direct-to-consumer business as well. So we're a buyer of coffee. We buy green coffee, but we have customers. We sell coffee as well. And we're known for our values of quality, sustainability, and education. And we're also known for transparency. We were the first coffee roasting company to release a transparency report back in 2009, and we release one annually. And it discusses a lot of different aspects of our business, but most importantly, it makes visible who we buy coffee from, and how much we pay for the coffee that we ultimately sell. So why transparency? I mean, I think it has a lot to do with it builds quality, it builds sustainability, it creates a brighter future for coffee. But the nuts and bolts of it, as a business, we have the power to decide how much we pay for coffee, and we also get to set the price at which we sell our coffee. If you're familiar with business fundamentals, ideally that sale price covers your costs and leaves room for a profit. But the reality is trickier. Our consumers and our customers have choices. And so if they choose consistently a cheaper option from another roaster and we start to lose market share, then we need to take some action. One thing, the easiest thing to do is lower our prices. But to maintain profitability, that means that we have to cut a cost elsewhere. So as a company, we know that green coffee is undervalued, and we believe that farmers don't always get a fair share. So we don't want to pay less for the coffee that we buy. We also, from thinking about our values, we want a high quality product. We want our supply chains to be resilient and sustainable. We want people working in coffee to be excited about the future. So paying less for coffee is not the first lever that we're going to pull there. We have a couple of other options. We can look at other business costs to cut so that we can offer our customers a good price and continue to pay as much as we can to our suppliers. So that might be things like not opening coffee shops, looking for different equipment that we can use that saves labor on production, trying to find a balance between attractive and affordable packaging. And another strategy is to build up demand for higher value coffee. And so that's where transparency comes in. We talk about the need to pay farmers more in order to ensure their resilience and sustainability. We can demonstrate what we pay and how that compares to the rest of the market. And in doing so, we attract consumers interested in and willing to pay more for a bit of positive impact. So the transparency report that we release every year, it talks about it talks about a lot of different parts of our business, but in terms of coffee and supply, we talk about our partnerships, the length of partnerships that we've maintained. So Mountain Harvest, we've been working with for 6 years. 90% of our coffee volume, more or less, comes from suppliers that we've been working with for 5 years and longer. So it talks about the length of partnership and the impact that has. But it also publishes the price that we pay for coffee. And context is really key there. Like telling you that I pay $3.50 a pound doesn't really mean much unless you understand that the market price is $2.40 and the fair trade price is $3. That really helps you put into context the impact that we're making. So the work that we did with 60 Decibels and Mountain Harvest earlier this year was a new kind of initiative for us. Rather than focus on price, which is top of mind for many in a supply chain, the survey focused on impact, or really the outcomes of that price and other things. not just price, but access that farmers have and who they're working with, and really asked and looked at, are those farmers thriving? That survey sort of helped us understand impact from a farmer's point of view and see whether broadly the entire approach, who we're choosing to work with, the price that we're paying, is it helping and where does it need to improve?
Amazing. Katie, thank you so much for sharing that. I found so much interesting, and I could go on and on, but what stood out to me particularly was how you spoke about thinking of price and other factors of coffee relative to players or relative to standards out there. And that's important to think about. Thank you for setting the larger context. On that note, I'm very excited to introduce our next speaker. We have Kenneth from the Mountain Harvest team. He is the managing director. Mountain Harvest does some fantastic work with smallholders, like I was saying earlier. And Kenneth, before I bring you onto this webinar stage, I'd love to ask you why you think tuning into farmer well-being matters to your business. We'd love for you to reflect a bit on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Greetings from Uganda, a country that produces a lot of coffee, around 6% of the total global coffee production. Brief introduction of Mountain Harvest. We were established in 2017 to support farmers on Mount Elgon to bypass the commodity price. We believed that the way pricing is set, the farmers are not able to be profitable, to run profitable businesses. Our approach emphasizes the need to boost productivity and improve profitability at the farm level, at the farmer group level, and at our enterprise levels through an innovative service delivery model that focuses on promoting regenerative agriculture practices, youth employment in agriculture, gender inclusion, elevating the quality of coffee into the specialty segment, and then disconnecting pricing from the commodity price using the additional margins that we generate to pay farmers a higher price. We do now 30% above farm gate price, but is linked to their production cost because we want them to be profitable. And then investing in financial literacy and income diversification into alternative products. So the first thing that comes to my mind when I think of understanding the well-being of farmers is a question of whether an intermediary like Mountain Harvest that buys only coffee from farmers can have enough agents to influence the farmers and their well-being in a significant way. Mountain Harvest believes that farmers we can only work to improve farmers' well-being if we stop working in silos and approach the resources and the problems that they have in a more holistic manner. Measuring the farmers' well-being with groups like 60 Decibels and Counterculture Coffee, first of all, our business exists because they are farmers. If farmers are not there, and then we are in trouble. So understanding their well-being is crucial. It helps us develop and build our business model to support them. And then by working with a buyer like Counterculture Coffee and of course 60 Decibels, we are able to build evidence that we need to facilitate our business model. Remember, our business model relies on disconnecting from the C market price. We are demanding a higher price. So this helps us to provide the data points and increase transparency and traceability to justify our high prices. It's almost impossible, we know, for farmers to make money without higher prices. Lastly, and speaking directly to this particular measurement, Mountain Harvest uses the results from this measurement to inform our business model, especially creating awareness among buyers and approaching the farm as a business entity that has more than coffee. We see, for example, from such a measurement that the farmers are actually losing money. Luckily enough, they are still committed. So it alerts us to invest in providing a better price, supporting them to make sure that the next generation of farmers, which will be more educated, and will most likely have more choices, including producing other products, stay in coffee production. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kenneth. Thank you for sharing that. Particularly interesting that you nudge us to think about a coffee farmer or their farm as more than just a growing entity of producers, and more of as a business that needs better prices to earn a living income or to build their resilience in the future. And we also loved your point around how that builds farmer loyalty. We often see that these are factors that encourages farmers to keep coming back to the same buyers. Thank you for sharing. Now that we've talked a little bit about farmers, now's a good time to pivot and direct ourselves to what farmers had to say to us directly about the situation on the ground. To do that, I'm going to introduce our next speaker, who is Ellie Turner, the agriculture lead at 60 Decibels. Ellie is going to walk us through some of our key findings from the latest Coffee Farmer Thriving Index report that we have launched. The report features data from several cooperatives as well as a national panel study, one of the cooperatives being Mountain Harvest. Over to you, Ellie.
Thanks, Malvika, and thanks so much, Katie and Kenneth. It's been such a pleasure to collaborate with you this year. For those of you who have been clamoring for slides in the Q&A, now is your time. Get ready for some charts from 60 Decibels. But first, I'm going to take a quick minute just to introduce us so you sort of understand where we're coming from. Can you go? Yeah, this one. So 60 Decibels, we are a social impact measurement company. The name of the company, 60 Decibels, is the volume of human conversation. That's because we believe that in order to measure social impact, you have to listen to the people on whom you're trying to have that impact. And really what our methodology is an easy way to listen to end beneficiaries, or in my case, typically to listen to smallholder farmers. The methodology itself, which we call lean data, is really geared toward the private sector. It's geared toward making it easy for companies in particular who don't necessarily have a lot of expertise in evaluation or a lot of staff or resources to devote to it. We really want to make it easy for them to measure their social impact, to be able to understand their farmer suppliers and to communicate that impact. And so sort of the key pillars of our approach are here on the screen for you. The first is listening, which I already mentioned. The second is that it's speedy and it's standardized. Again, we try to make it as easy as possible for companies. And we also want to make it easy for the farmers. And so we don't want to go in and spend 4 hours with them telling us everything about their lives. Our methodology is really centered around a 15-minute interview with the farmer to be respectful of their time and also to turn the results around back to the companies pretty quickly. We do all of our interviews over the phone, again, in about a 15-minute phone conversation. We have local researchers in over 90 countries who are local, they speak local languages, they are trained by 60 Decibels, and they're having these phone conversations with the farmers and inputting the data back into our system. And the final pillar of our approach is our benchmarks. And so a lot of what we do is using standardized metrics and questions to the same farmers over and over again, to different farmers over again, hundreds of thousands of times. And what this has allowed us to do is establish performance benchmarks across the different sectors that we work in. And so when we ask the question, not only do you get a company result to see how your farmers are doing, but we can compare that to an industry or a regional benchmark, which really helps contextualize performance. And that's been really useful for investors to understand, impact investors to understand sort of differentially across their portfolio, how their companies are comparing. So that's a quick aside about 60 Decibels. So you got to understand how we came into this, since we are not a coffee company. We do social impact measurement. Okay, so next slide. Why the Farmer Thriving Index? So this idea sort of came about a couple of years ago through our work actually with chocolate companies. This sort of question of understanding how farmers are doing. So we have different companies that are working with different standards or different certifications that might say like, okay, we're paying this price, or we're doing these practices, or we're protecting the environment. But none of that actually gives you the farmer's voice or the farmer's perspective on how they're doing, and it doesn't really get a holistic understanding. And so we wanted to sort of develop a way for companies, first in cocoa and then in coffee, and really in any commodity sector, to understand from a farmer's perspective in a holistic way how that farmer is doing. Are they barely surviving, or are they thriving? And we wanted to do it in a standardized way so that companies could be able to compare their farmers to a benchmark or to other peers in their industry. And so that's really sort of was the driving kind of idea behind this, which I would say we would consider a pilot to sort of test, can this idea work? Can we measure farmer well-being in a holistic way, in the same way across a bunch of companies at the same time? We can go to the next slide. So to develop the index itself, we worked with a technical working group of stakeholders from the coffee sector to decide on what are questions that we could ask in a simple way, in a 15-minute phone conversation that a farmer would understand, that would give us this holistic picture of how they're doing. And so what we landed on for the final index was these 4 dimensions that you see on the screen right now. The first is living standards. So this is based on their consumption patterns in the week preceding the survey, whether those consumption patterns and their expenditures are reflective of the established living income benchmark, which reflects a decent standard of living in Uganda. The second dimension is resilience. So this is both financial resilience. Are they saving? Could they respond if there was an emergency that they needed to pay for? And then also access to critical services and resilient practices on their farm. The third dimension is farming outlook. So this is really where we're getting that farmer's perspective on coffee as a livelihood. And if they see it as something that is viable for them, that is profitable for them, that they want to continue investing in, or if they see it as something that they need to move away from. And the fourth dimension is food security. And for this, we use a standard measure called the Reduced Coping Strategy Index, which is based on the number of times a household has had to use any particular coping strategy to feed their families, again, in the week preceding the survey. We can go to the next slide. So before we launched the index with specific brands and cooperatives, we wanted to establish a national benchmark so we could understand, okay, in Uganda, on average, how's the average farmer doing? And that would allow brands and cooperatives to compare their farmers to this benchmark. And so we conducted a national survey with over 1,000 farmers in Uganda. You can see they're distributed across 4 different regions of Uganda. They were recruited semi-randomly, so they're not affiliated with any particular cooperative or brand. And you can just see a couple of the profile characteristics there on the screen. If you know Uganda really well, you'll know that Robusta makes up more than 50% of the coffee, but we wanted to oversample Arabica a little bit so that we would have a point of comparison, recognizing that a lot of the specialty brands would be more relevant to compare to Arabica growers. And then we had nearly half selling mostly as raw cherries and half selling as parchment, which is dried or processed bean. And now I'm going to take you through some of the high-level insights. You can go to the next slide. It is going to be a bunch of bar charts in true 60 decibels form, but I promise I will make it really easy for you to understand them. So the first sort of key insight is that 1 in 3 coffee farmers told us that they didn't earn more than they spent on coffee last year. To kind of go back to Katie's point on business fundamentals, this is sort of what makes it possible to continue doing something. So it's their perception, but it is a good indicator of a struggle to have 1 in 3 not even earning a profit from this livelihood. And then you can see these second bars are showing you the difference between farmers who have sold as parchment versus sold as raw. And so you can see that farmers who are selling as parchment are more likely to say that they've earned a profit, and they're more likely to say that they got a good price for their coffee, which just points to something that we found sort of throughout the survey in Uganda, which was that those selling as parchment tended to do a little bit better. We can go to the next one. The next key finding here is that on average, nationally, access to critical services is extremely low. So if you look here, the second blue bar is agricultural extension. This is training or information that is provided to farmers either by the government, by a cooperative, by an NGO that tells them, what to plant, how to prune, how to manage their coffee trees. And only 19% of farmers report having reliable access to agricultural extension. Similarly, really low numbers on weather information, on credit, and we had half of farmers saying they didn't have reliable access to any of these services. Next slide. And here you'll see we asked about 4 different practices that a farmer might use on their coffee farm. And we divided it up between farmers who did have access to reliable agricultural extension and those who did not. And you can see the difference in these sort of two colors on the chart. Farmers who have reliable access to agricultural extension are more likely to report that they are using composting, that they're conserving water on their farm, slightly more likely to report intercropping, and similar on integrated pest management. And so this, I think, is a slide that tells, if you know anything about agriculture, sort of just reinforces something that you probably already know, which is that agricultural extension and training promotes the adoption of good agricultural practices. Go ahead to the next one. So then we mentioned financial resilience. Half of the farmers that we spoke to are pretty vulnerable to financial shocks. And so you see these red bars here, almost half of farmers are not saving at all. And 43% of farmers said that if they needed to come up with $50 in the next month for an emergency, it would be really hard for them to do so. And so that just sort of underscores the vulnerability financially of if a shock occurs, that they might need to resort to some sort of coping mechanism that might have more negative longer term consequences because they don't have those financial resources to cover it in the moment. But somehow these farmers are still really optimistic about coffee production. We have 3/4 of farmers who said that they're planning to increase their investment in their coffee farm next year. And 80% of farmers who said that they want their children to produce coffee as adults. Now, a lot of you are probably thinking, did you ask the children themselves? And the answer is no, we didn't. We don't survey children, but really this was to understand the farmer's own perspective. So not necessarily if the children are going to do it or not, but from the farmer's perspective, do they see it as a livelihood that's good enough for their children? Or do they want their children to do something else because they think that coffee is not viable? And so the answer is sort of a resounding yes. They believe in coffee as a good livelihood opportunity. So this is my last slide. So up until right now, everything that I've shown you has been from that national survey of 1,000 farmers that had no affiliation with any particular cooperative. So what you're seeing here now is the results from Mountain Harvest survey. So we spoke to 275 farmers that work with Mountain Harvest, and we asked them the same questions that we asked in the national survey. And here you can sort of see how they compare on each of these dimensions. I know it's a lot of numbers, and we're just going to walk you through them really quickly. So the first is the living income benchmark. So you'll see that Mountain Harvest has 41% of the farmers earning above the living income benchmark. And that number for the region that Mountain Harvest is in is 36%. So you see there, they're outperforming that benchmark. Similarly, on ability to afford emergencies, you'll see that they're slightly higher than the national average. But on these next two, on savings and on access to agricultural extension, the results are much, much higher for Mountain Harvest. So you see 62% of Mountain Harvest farmers are saving every month versus 25% on national average. And then what I was just speaking about with regards to agricultural extension being really low nationwide, 71% of Mountain Harvest farmers said that they had access to reliable extension, which is really great. So then going down to the next one, outlook, we see actually fewer farmers reporting that they earned a profit at Mountain Harvest. Similar, reporting a very good price. Slightly more looking to invest more in their farms next year, and just a couple more saying that they want their children to grow coffee as adults. And then our very last dimension here, food security, we did observe higher levels of food security among Mountain Harvest farmers than on average. So this is just meant to be a sort of snapshot to give you an understanding of sort of what it looks like for one company or for one cooperative or supplier to get their own results and to compare them to a national benchmark. We did, as part of this initiative, we did 4 different cooperatives in Uganda that all got their results like this compared to the national average. We also did 4 cooperatives in Rwanda, which of course are not directly comparable. We didn't have a benchmark there just because we weren't able to do national studies in both countries. And so those companies got their results and they got to compare them sort of to each other. And then we actually did one cooperative in the DRC as well. So with that, I guess just a quick congratulations to Mountain Harvest for doing such a great job. And then I will turn it back to Malvika.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Ellie. That was really snappy, and I'm glad we got through most of the insights. Super. So I'd love to open the floor for a discussion now, and this is a cue to all attendees here. Feel free to use the Q&A feature on Zoom that you should be able to see at the bottom of your screen to share any questions for the panelists or any reflections or comments that you may have. I can actually see that there are a couple that have already trickled in, and we see one, Katie, that's directed towards counterculture. So maybe we get started with you. The question is, how different is counterculture coffee from existing fair trade coffee that has been around for a long time?
That's a good question. Well, it is different in that there is not a third party that is kind of certifying a specific set of standards, which is partly what fair trade does. Fair trade is a little confusing to talk about because in the US, there are two different entities which certified fair trade coffee, and they recently diverged from each other in very important ways. So it's hard to answer it as like fair trade being one thing. Fair Trade USA has a different minimum price standard than Fair Trade International. But some of the things that counterculture has in common with fair trade is a commitment to paying good prices to farmers. So the price that and being transparent about what that price is. So last year in 2023, counterculture paid around, I think it was $3.30 per pound export price for all of our coffee when you average it out on a weighted average basis. And I want to say that the fair trade price that year was around $2 and something. So above what the minimum is, which for fair trade is around $1, had been around $1.80. But of course that raises when the C market raises. So yeah, that's basically what we have in common with fair trade is paying more for coffee and being transparent about what we pay. But the mechanism for doing that is a little bit different. There's no certification board. There's no stamp on our bag. It's more of just a philosophy of being transparent at counterculture, whereas fair trade has a system that people sort of buy into and that they co-advertise their coffee with.
Yeah, thank you for calling out the distinction. I think there was another interesting follow-up, Katie. I'm just going to let you address that one as well before I ask Ellie her next question, which is, how do you sort of build demand for high-value coffee in the context of the higher costs across the board for consumers, especially consumers who are sort of trying to save money wherever they can?
Yeah, that's it's going to be my lifelong work to do that, essentially. I've been working on it for 20 years and I haven't exactly cracked the code. But yeah, I think education is a part of it. So, at counterculture, we don't have coffee shops, but in all the major cities that we sell coffee in, we have these training centers. So it's a space for coffee classes to happen. We have local support staff, so we'll always have a salesperson, a technician. That person is there to install equipment, to fix equipment, an educator that teaches barista classes from Espresso 101 to, pouring latte art. And something that we do at each of those training centers is every Friday morning, we have a free public coffee tasting at 10 a.m. So you don't have to register, you don't have to pay. If there's a training center in your city, you can go by on Friday morning and grab a cup of coffee and hear about the supply chain behind it. So that's just one of the things that we do that we see as an investment in developing coffee consumers and getting people to understand that there's a team of people behind every cup of coffee, and that each of those supply chains has its own unique challenges and also like its own unique characteristics that make the coffee taste the way that it does, and make it a special experience. So there are things like that. The transparency report, it's just little investments and getting people to think about coffee in a different way. But I don't have the exact formula. Do X, Y, and Z, and then people will pay more. It's changing all the time.
Thanks, Katie. And we appreciate your candor. Thank you so much. Ellie, we have a lot of questions on how farmers were selected, differences by certain segments. I'm going to aggregate some of those for you. So could you first share a bit more about how our farmers for the panel were selected and if there were any differences by gender?
Sure. This is a great question. In an ideal world, we would have had a list of every coffee farmer in Uganda and their phone numbers, and we would have randomly selected them, but that census does not exist. And so what we did was we got the data that we could get from the UCDA, the Uganda Coffee Development Authority, on the production volumes by district. And we decided on a distribution across regions and districts to get a cross-section of different geographic areas. Within each of those, we did a random selection of villages. Within the villages that we randomly selected, we sent enumerators to go and perform like random walk routes to enroll coffee farmers. And so it's not a perfect representative sample, but it was sort of the best we could do in a lean way to get a good distribution across different regions, across age groups, and across different villages within the regions. We did disaggregate all of the data by gender, desperate for an insight that would show a gender difference. And really surprisingly, we did not see huge differences by gender across most of the data. Actually, if I'm wrong, Malvika, you can tell me if there was one or two, but I don't think that we found any, or they would have been a feature in the report.
Yeah. And there's so many intricate sort of household dynamics that often come into play when we think about smallholder farmers and how the farm is run. So yes, to your point, Ellie, we didn't see very many gender-based trends. While we're on the subject of farmer households and well-being, Kenneth, we have a question for you from one of our audience members who's asking what the main challenges are to transition, to allow farmers to transition to regenerative agriculture, and how companies such as yourself can promote this transition more seamlessly.
Okay, thank you. So the regenerative agriculture practices that we are promoting include agroforestry, diversifying the crops within the piece of land, application, production and application of organic manure. All of these require financing, and it's the first challenge. So financing for the farmer, who is supposed to buy tools, who is supposed to buy seedlings from academia for avocado, who is supposed to buy seed for legumes, who is supposed to produce organic manure. So that is the main challenge. The next challenge is the knowledge gaps with the farmers, for the farmers to start challenging the practices that they have. An example, farmers believing that planting avocado within the coffee garden will attract pests and diseases. So the knowledge gaps and the resources and the financing, it's what Mountain Harvest now tries to bridge that gap. For example, providing microfinance access to microloans, financing the crops, agreeing with other off-takers for other products to buy them so that Mountain Harvest can recover that investment. So that's where that's what I would highlight.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. We also had a quick follow-up from somebody who's asking how Mountain Harvest translated some of these results and findings into tangible actions. Is there anything in particular that stood out?
Yes. So number one, like I mentioned in the introduction, our business model is open on challenging the pricing system in the world. As you remember, the pricing system for coffee starts with a consumer who says, I have this much, I don't care what it took you to produce, take it or leave it. Whereas the general principles of commerce is the producer says, it took me $1 to produce, I want 20% margin, this is my price. So because we are coming so boldly to challenge the status quo, we need evidence. So the first that we have now, what we've been claiming, now we have verified independent results showing that the farmer is losing money. The farmer actually knows they are not making money. So we are using this information to convince our buyers that there is a need and there is a reason for them to pay a price that is higher than the sea market price. That is the first one. The second it's to start investing in making the farm even more profitable. Because if the farmer says, I know I'm not making money, but I hope my child will invest in coffee, will continue investing in coffee. Yet we know that more than 50% of our population in Uganda is below 17, which means we are going to have the next generation of a more informed farmer, and chances are they will realize they have other choices. And that threatens our existence as a company, as a coffee intermediary. So that helps us refocus our investment to make sure that the farmer is profitable and the next generation finds a more profitable enterprise. Thank you.
Yeah, that's interesting, Kenneth. And you're saying so much that's actually tying back to some of the questions I'm seeing in the Q&A box. So I'm going to continue to put you on the spot for a few more seconds. One of our listeners is asking if you can tell us a bit more about why you think farmers want future generations to continue growing coffee. Ellie was talking about this as a specific metric of the Farmer Thriving Index. But what do you think is driving that? And do you think it's linked to sort of a certain macroeconomic context?
Was that for me or for Kenneth? Sorry.
That was for Kenneth.
Okay, that's what I thought.
So
Sorry.
I think I missed that. My
Sorry,
apologies.
Kenneth. I can repeat the question. It was about why, why you think farmers would want the future generations to continue growing coffee. Could it be due to a macroeconomic reason or something else?
So it's mainly about believing that they do not have any choice. Coffee is the only source of cash. So they will see any other product. For information, we are talking about smallholder farmers that have an average of 1 acre. That's the only piece of land that they have. And the farming household is about 5 people. So they see the land is just enough to feed them, to meet their food needs, some vegetables, some grain. But the only source of money that they need for medical care, they need for education, it's only coming out of coffee. They don't see any other product. So they believe that it's the only choice. But we also know that that belief is based on the high illiteracy levels. And we know that the younger population that is coming as the next generation, just to mention that the average coffee farmer in Uganda is aged 63. It's that's the average farmer. So the next generation is going to come with more information. It's more literate. And we believe that they will make different choices than the choices that their parents are making.
Thanks, Kenneth.
I see a question from Julian. Would you like me to go ahead?
We could, but there's a couple that I'm seeing for Ellie and Katie also, so maybe we circle back.
Okay, great.
Okay. Thank you, Kenneth. It's really nice how optimistic your response sounded. It's very encouraging. Ellie, this one's for you. It's now your turn. What other KPIs besides income or living income, for example, would you recommend to measure farmer well-being? We've spoken about 4 so far as a part of the FTI. So they're curious about what other dimensions you'd consider.
Yeah, I mean, I think so within the FTI, I think some of the ones that we use that are most critical are food security. And this doesn't get captured with living income very well because, as Kenneth just mentioned, they're growing food and they're eating it. And so if you're asking what they earn and you're not monetizing the crops that they're earning and eating, you're not getting their food security. And so I think number one is asking if they have enough food to eat. I think some of the questions that we didn't ask here, but that sometimes we like to use instead of income are around if your children are in school, if you have access to safe water, if you have a safe place to live. These actually make up the definition of a decent standard of living, which is the whole concept behind the living income benchmark. But asking them in a straightforward way, rather than having to back into like, what is the amount of income and the cost of living and the price and all these things that would allow for that, and just asking them, are your children able to go to school? If you need healthcare, do you get it? Are really straightforward and tell you a lot about if they're doing okay.
Thanks, Ellie. Another follow-up for you, which is what percentage of the total coffee farmer's livelihood is generally made up of coffee? And are you able to attribute how well the farmers are doing, whether they're thriving or surviving, to coffee alone from the information that we got from the Farmer Thriving Index?
Such a good question. Because living income, which is a concept that the coffee industry is really focused on, is actually defined as all sources of household income. And what we found, I think, is that most of the farmers, I think, were around half to 75% of their income, maybe even actually lower than that, came from coffee. And so they have other sources as well, in addition to the other crops that they're growing. And so when you think about a household where only half of their money is coming from coffee, and that's only in like particular seasons of the year, then just changing that one lever isn't going to be the thing that fully changes their household income or lifts them out of poverty. So it is really important to think about their other sources of income as well.
Absolutely. And so much of the dependency comes from other crops. So thank you for sharing, Ellie. Katie, we have a quick one for you, which is how relevant do you think it is to tell the story of what you do to end consumers, as a principle? The question mentions that, you're not directly talking to consumers per se on a day-to-day basis all the time, but, you're sort of a part of a larger chain of trust where, your consumers believe that the coffee is coming from a certain source and they sort of invest in that idea. So do you have any reflections on that?
Yeah. I tend to think it's the storytelling part is really important. I think the coffee industry in general has gone through different cycles and waves with this. I think there have been times where the industry has been more focused on the technical aspects of the product in order to sell specialty, and really like inward looking, thinking about the craftsmanship behind the product, like the intrinsic value of the product itself. And then there are other times when I got into specialty coffee, it was more of a marketing and story driven time in specialty coffee. It was all about like, it wasn't necessarily that this coffee was better than commercial. It really was like it had this unique province and it had a story of the producers behind it. And I think that that's kind of coming back around again. It kind of taps into what consumers desire. It is more reactive to market trends rather than an industry's like own view of what is right and wrong in terms of quality. And it's more open to kind of shaping the product, the story, and the product itself to be what the market wants. Basically, but why I care about telling the story about what counterculture does generally and about the coffees that we sell specifically is that, I see consumers increasingly aligning their purchases with their personal values. So telling a story about a product really gets that value and that identity connection across a lot more than like a cup score. I honestly think stories are more memorable. Like when people ask like, what makes this different or why do you like this? Like a story behind what is unique about that product to me is more interesting than, than something about, again, technical aspects of it. And I also think that the story kind of humanizes the product. It makes them more relatable and it gives kind of people, places, and business values for people to connect with when they're making a choice to like buy coffee from our company versus other people's. So those are my thoughts.
Thanks, Katie. I hope you don't mind one other follow-up, which is sort of how, in your perspective, across the supply chain, how can we gain necessary information to make decisions about, consumers or make decisions about farmer well-being? So, of course, we had the FDI study, which is one element of it. But how does counterculture coffee continue to seek this relevant information?
Yeah, this is a big thing to think through because it takes a lot of energy and for people to gather information, and you want it to be significant, meaningful. Like you not only want it to, I think for me, understanding something and coming to consensus is enough, but I think other people in the business would like it to have an impact on the bottom line, right? They would like to see some actionable result from it. But it's all about figuring out the question that you need to ask in order to get at that result that you're looking to measure, whether it be we want to be able to market this, or we want to be able to make a change in our business, because we're going to ask this question and it's going to make an impact on how we engage with farmers. And also finding that balance of like the questions that you're asking and the capacity that you have to do that measurement, whether it be through a survey like 60 Decibels did, or some other way that you gather and track information. But I think that is a key thing. And I'm sure, Ellie, you and your team have talked about this ad nauseum, of what you keep in mind when designing these things, is that you want it to be simple enough that it's not overburdensome from a gathering perspective, and then, but actually get at some key truths that you feel like are actionable by the people participating in that supply chain.
Yeah, absolutely. For us, I mean, typically we are interviewing farmers that work with a specific company or cooperative, right? And so our methodology is always to limit it to 15 minutes to make it really simple for them, to take notes of their time, but also to communicate to them that, you know, their responses are going to help improve the services that they receive from this company. So in that sense, we often get like a high interest in responding, because they appreciate giving their feedback sort of directly to this company that they work with. With the panel, it was a little bit different with the national survey, because they had no connection to us whatsoever. We didn't say, you know, we're with Mountain Harvest, we want to help them. And in this situation, they received a compensation for their time, very minimally, but at least in terms of airtime for participating in the survey from an ethical perspective.
Yeah, thanks for sharing, Ellie. There's always this endeavor to sort of get the right information without it being extractive, and that's always a fine balance. And yeah, we truly rely on some of our respondents and farmers talking about the company and, you know, being willing to do so over a 15 to 20-minute conversation. Kenneth, I'd love to redirect the conversation back to you, because I know there's a question on a farm gate price. So just for the audience's benefit, the question is, if the farm gate price is on average about 10% of the retail price for beans, what needs to change in the coffee value chain to bring more value to farmers? In particular, what can be done to improve their power in the value chain? Now, we know that certifications is a big angle to it, but we'd love to hear your take on this.
Okay, thank you. Very interesting question. And there is another number that I would like to put in. In Uganda, we have an agency, a government agency called Uganda Coffee Development Authority. And every day it publishes prices, the farm gate prices and the C market prices. So I just looked at their website now. The price, the C price they are mentioning is $2.3, $2.39 per pound of coffee. That is the C price for the best coffee on Mount Elgon, while the farm gate price for parchment is $3.3. I need 30 tons of parchment to fill a container. So basically, I'm giving a farmer, as of this week, $90,000 to fill a container, $90,000 to fill a container that I am to sell 100,380. That is 98% of the value is going to the farmer. So I think where the gap is, it's at the end. And I think Julian had a question about telling the story and creating awareness. We have to reach the consumer, the roaster. They have to understand that there is no more money before we get to the end of the chain to give to the farmer. If we are to give a farmer more money, then we need to see a better C market price. We need to see a higher price that is paid by a consumer. Thank you.
Thank you for sprinkling in some of the stats from the website as well, Kenneth. Appreciate it. We have roughly 3 to 4 minutes left, and I think there was one more question for you, Kenneth, where One of our audience members said that you had mentioned that we need sort of to see the evidence of impact on smallholders and how that's important to witness. What sort of evidence do you think people care about the most?
So the first, thank you for that question. The first one, it's always about how much of the money that I'm paying is going to the farmer, because there is always a bias that the farmer is not getting a good price, and therefore the exporter, the intermediary, is the one getting the money. So that is the first interest. They want to understand the breakdown of the cost of production. The second, most of the buyers that we work with are normal human beings who would like to see positive change in the world. So they want to see the change in livelihoods. They want to see income increasing, productivity increasing, food security increasing. So those are the common questions that we are asked. And those are the data points that we do focus on to provide that kind of transparency. Thank you.
Yeah. Kenneth, would you also be able to share what percentage of Mountain Harvest coffee is exported specifically, also in the wider sector? I think some folks are curious about percentage of exports.
Okay, so number one, Uganda produces about 6 million bags, 6 to 7 million bags. All of that coffee, most of it, about 96 is exported. We drink very little coffee in Uganda. Number two, the farmer sells all the coffee, so they don't drink coffee. Number three, Mountain Harvest, we export all the coffee, but it is a very significant value. We export about 13 containers in a year. That is a very small value, volume within the broader country numbers.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. Amazing. Kenneth, that was really insightful. And Katie, thank you for also chiming in with so many insights on the power of storytelling to consumers and why transparency matters. We appreciate it. Kenneth, we're always a fan of your ability to supplement all of your thoughts with numbers. It's always helpful to put things into perspective. And Ellie, thank you so much for a very quick walkthrough of our insights and answering some of these key questions on our sampling strategy and what we learned from farmers. I think the broader objective of this webinar was to also sort of encourage that, to tune in more closely to farmer voices, to listen better and to understand what we can do collectively as a sector to ensure our farmers are thriving. So thanks to everybody who has joined. Right after this call, you'll also get a recording. So in case you've missed the first few minutes, that's totally fine. You can watch the recording later. And we'd also love your feedback on the webinar. You should be able to see a link in the chat box. Feel free to click on it and share your feedback. And of course, otherwise we can follow up later as well. Thanks so much for attending and have a good evening, good day, wherever you are.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.